Welcome to Unit 2 of this environmental science subject, the part 2 of Unit 2, which is ecosystems. What are they and how do they work? Questions that will be answered in this lectures are the following. What keeps us and other organisms alive? What are the major components of an ecosystem? What happens to energy and matter in an ecosystem? How do scientists study ecosystems? And what are the three big ideas learned from this chapter? Now, the core case study of this lecture is about rainforests that are slowly disappearing. So, tropical rainforest covers about 2% of the Earth's land surface, and it contains about 50% of the world's known plant and animal species. So, typically, these rainforests are found in the equator. So, these countries are mega diverse in terms of plants and animal species. But due to human activities, one of those like grazing or deforestation, building of built-up areas, and other human-related activities, it disrupts this ecosystem and could lead to harmful effects. So one of those harmful effects is reduced biodiversity. So by reducing biodiversity, we reduce the ability of biodiverse tropical systems to regulate the climate or provide sustenance or food to humans and animals alike. And more importantly, we deplete or degrade the habitat of these major or diverse plants and species. Another effect is it accelerates global warming. Why? Because when we reduce the diversity of plants in a tropical rainforest, we reduce the ability of that ecosystem to take up carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases rather. So another major effect is changing regional weather patterns. So we are currently experiencing severe weather patterns like stronger typhoons, stronger flooding, stronger cyclones, especially in the Atlantic region, and also other severe droughts, severe heat. So those are changing regional weather patterns that we're currently experiencing, and it reduces the ability of these plants and animals that lives in a rainforest to gain back or to grow back to its original form. So these are the major effects, the three major effects of um, disrupting or destroying our tropical rainforest. Now here's a satellite image of the changing rainforest landscape due to natural degradation. So this is a picture or a satellite image of a city in Bolivia called Santa Cruz. So this is the forest cover during June 17, 1975, but by May 2003, this is now the tropical rainforest cover. So a lot of space there has already been used by humans for farming, agriculture, building of built-up areas. So this is how the way we humans are naturally degrading our tropical rainforest. So now that we've tackled the core case study in depth, we now proceed to the first section of this lecture, which is what keeps us and other organisms alive. And within this section are two concepts that we will be able to learn. First of that is the four major components of the Earth's life support system: the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the geosphere, and the biosphere. And the second concept is that life is sustained by the flow of energy from the sun through the biosphere, the cycling of nutrients within the biosphere, and gravity. These are the four major components of Earth's life support system. We have the atmosphere, And under the atmosphere, we have layers of the atmosphere, which includes the troposphere, where weather pattern happens. And as the height increases in the troposphere, the temperature also decreases. So it gets colder as height increases. And this is usually where weather patterns happen, like wind, precipitation, um, air currents is happening. And the next to above the troposphere is the tropopause, and then next to the tropopause is the next layer, which is the stratosphere, which contains the ozone layer. Now, the stratosphere, as the height increases, its temperature increases. It gets hotter. Why? Because the ozone layer is primarily responsible for absorbing UV rays or ultraviolet rays. So this layer is very important because this is a layer where um, the absorbance of harmful UV rays from the sun is happening. So when our human activities are destroying our ozone layer by releasing freons or CFC, fluorocarbons, so we depletes the ability of the ozone layer to protect us from UV ray. So next or above the stratosphere is a thin layer called the stratopause, and above the stratopause is the next major layer, which is the mesosphere. So again, the mesosphere, as its height increases, once more the the temperature decreases. It gets colder. So it's a pattern, no? In the troposphere, as the height goes up, the temperature decreases. Next to that, which is the stratosphere, when the height increases, the temperature increases or gets hotter. And then next to it is the mesosphere, where as the height increases, the temperature decreases again. So next to the mesosphere, above it is the mesopause, and then um, up, up above this mesopause is the thermosphere. This is another major layer, thermosphere. I shall not be elaborating or extensively discussing these layers. So next to the thermosphere is the ionosphere. And lastly, we have the exosphere, or the sphere which is closest to the outer space. So those are the layers of the atmosphere in Earth. Then the second Earth life supporting system component that Earth has is the hydrosphere, or the water. And next to the hydrosphere is the geosphere, which usually involves the land or the soil. So it can also be called as the lithosphere. The geosphere also includes the major components of Earth: the core, the inner core, the outer core, the mantle, and the crust. So next to the geosphere is the biosphere, where living organisms interact with these three other spheres. So these are the Earth's life support system, the four major components. Now here's an illustration of the general structure of the Earth. So we have first the atmosphere, this one, and this one. And then we have the hydrosphere, or the water. Then we have the biosphere, the living organisms. So these are organisms that usually thrive in a certain part in the atmosphere, specifically the troposphere and the stratosphere, and below in the lithosphere, so the deepest part of the crust where life is possible. So that's the biosphere. It also includes the hydrosphere. And we also have the crust here, the crust, the mantle. So the geosphere is composed of the crust, the mantle, and the core, which is composed of the inner and the outer. Now, these are some of the diverse life of plants and animals, and even organisms like bacteria that thrives on Earth. That they are interacting with the non-living factors of Earth like the Earth or land, the water, and the air or the atmosphere. Now, how does the planet sustain this life, very diverse life on Earth? So there are three factors that helps Earth sustain life. One is the one-way flow of high energy. So from the solar energy from the sun, it is taken up by plants and converted into chemical energy and heat to, to be able to produce food. So the food that the plant generates will be taken up by living things and is converted once more into another type of chemical energy for them to move and do their metabolic processes. And then this energy generated by humans or animals is released as heat into the environment, and some are deflected back to space. So another factor is the cycling of nutrients to parts of the biosphere. So the five major nutrients that is being recycled on Earth: carbon, the nitrogen, the sulfur, the phosphorus, and water, or H2O. And then we have the gravity that holds Earth's atmosphere. So it's the responsibility of the gravity to hold the Earth's atmosphere together. So without the gravity, our atmosphere shall collapse. Now, the solar energy from the sun that is received by the Earth is what makes life possible on Earth. And the solar energy also that the Earth receives from the sun is what regulates the climate of the Earth. So what are those energies that the sun are usually emitting? We have the UV or ultraviolet rays, the visible rays or in our electromagnetic spectrum, the rainbow colors that is visible to our human naked eye. Then we also have the infrared energy. So another one is radiation, and these are usually absorbed by the ozone and other atmospheric gases, since radiation can be harmful when we directly contact with it. And then also it's observed by the Earth. Then it is reflected by the Earth. So some of these radiation are reflected by the Earth to those layers that I've tackled a while ago, the stratosphere, the mesosphere. So each zone actually has a responsibility to absorb a certain type of solar radiation. And then we also have radiated by the atmosphere as heat. And lastly, the natural greenhouse effect. Now, the natural greenhouse effect usually occurs in the stratosphere or where the ozone layer happens. So we will tackle that more on or extensively on the next slide. This is an illustration of the flow of energy to and from the Earth. So solar radiation from the sun, some of those radiation are being absorbed by the earth, some are reflected back into the outer space, some are radiated by atmosphere as heat into outer space, and some are added to the troposphere and into the earth as heat. So this is a natural phenomena, so it's naturally occurring. So most of the UVs are also being absorbed by the ozone layer present in the stratosphere, here in the stratosphere. So this natural phenomena um, is what supports life on Earth. Now, another phenomena that is naturally occurring is greenhouse effect. So the greenhouse effect is like a covering blanket of the Earth that protects us from the harmful radiation from the suns. So the chemicals or substances that are present in the uh, stratosphere, like the ozone layer, and those other substances like carbon dioxide and nitrogen are naturally occurring. So they're in a natural way, they are present in the atmosphere, but because of human activities, anthropogenic activities, we are amplifying the amount of these naturally occurring substances like carbon dioxide in this part of the stratosphere. So when we increase the amount of carbon and nitrogen, the blanket that is covering the earth also thickens. So as it thickens, the ability of this blanket to to trap the heat that is being absorbed here on earth, inside earth, is also amplified. So that's why we are experiencing high temperatures, because we are thickening this greenhouse effect or blanket that covers the earth. Section of this lecture is what are the major components of an ecosystem. So some organisms produce the nutrients they need, other gets their nutrients by consuming other organisms, and some recycle nutrients back to producers by decomposing the waste and remains of organism. So that is an illustration of what the interaction of nature is. So ecologists study interactions in nature. So the study about the interaction of nature is what we call the ecology. So it is how organisms interact with each other and their non-living environment, or the non-living factors or component of the environment, which are the air, the water, and the land itself. So organisms, we have populations, we also have communities, ecosystems, the biosphere. Now this is an illustration of the levels of organization in nature. So it starts from the atom. So the atom. So an example for that is the oxygen atom and hydrogen atom. So this is the smallest unit of chemical elements that exhibits its own chemical properties. And from the atom, we go up to the molecule. An example of that is H2O or water. So it's a combination of two different elements, atoms of two different elements. So we have here element 1 hydrogen, element 2 oxygen. And then from a molecule, we go up to a compound. So a compound, and the specific compound that is the building block of life are those complex compounds. So this complex compound then leads to the cell. The cell is the fundamental structure and functional unit of life. So this is the fundamental structure and functional unit of life. So without the cell, life wouldn't be possible. So from the cell, it actually goes up to a tissue cells, right? And then from the tissue, it forms the organ, a certain organ. And then from an organ, like our liver, our lungs, our stomach, it goes up and forms an organ system. Now, an organ system, it could be our immune system, our nervous system, our reproductive system. So those are examples of organ systems. And then we arrive at an organism, an individual living being. So an organism can be classified into species of organism. So this species displays certain characteristics that are unique to each other. And then a species could form a population. A population or is a group of individuals of the same species living in a particular place. And then from a population, it forms a community. So a community is a population of different species living in a particular place and potentially interacting with each other. And then this community forms an ecosystem. An ecosystem is a community of different species interacting with one another and with their non-living environment of matter and energy. So an ecosystem could be a biome. So one example of a biome is a tundra. So those are examples. A marshland. So those are types of ecosystem. And this ecosystem then forms the biosphere. So a biosphere encompasses all ecosystems and even the Earth's air, water, and soil where life is found. So these are the levels of organization in nature. Now an ecosystem has its living and non-living components. The non-living, or its abiotic components are the water, the air, the nutrients, we have rocks, we have heat, and solar energy. And then the biotic ones, we have the living and the ones living, or those decayed matter or organic matter. Living could be a plant, an animal, a human, and even fungi, bacteria, and even viruses. So these are the abiotic and biotic components of an ecosystem. Now this one is a typical illustration of a certain ecosystem. So first, these are the abiotic factors, precipitation, even oxygen. Then we have water, soluble minerals, and then carbon dioxide. And then we have the producer as are the biotic, and this fox, the organism, and the rabbit. So these are the biotic factor ones rather. This one, the decayed matter. So these are the biotic factors. Now, this is a proper illustration of an ecosystem whereby the abiotic factors like water, soluble minerals, oxygen, and carbon dioxide are being taken up by plants to produce food. So the plants is our producer, and the food that the plants generates is being utilized by the rabbit, our primary consumer. And then this primary consumer is being also taken up by the fox as our secondary consumer. And then when this fox dies, it becomes a dead or decayed matter, and this decayed matter is being decomposed by bacteria. So the soluble mineral nutrients that is generated from the decomposition of this dead organic matter is then being taken up once more by plants. Now, every organism belongs to a particular trophic level depending in its source of nutrients. So we have the producers and consumers who are the living components of an ecosystem. So the producers are the ones we call autotrophs, and they are the ones responsible for producing foods. So examples of that are the plants. So they produce food by using the process photosynthesis, whereby carbon dioxide, H2O, in the presence of sunlight creates the food, glucose, and then oxygen. So typically, the chemical formula for the photosynthesis is CO2 plus H2O in the presence of sunlight or solar energy, which is then absorbed by the chlorophyll, will generate glucose, which is C6H12O6 in its chemical form, and then oxygen. But if you look at this chemical formula, this is not a balanced one. So the balance equation for that is 6CO2. So it generates with the 6 carbon dioxide compound or molecule plus 6H2O. It will generate C6 glucose H12O6 plus 2 oxygen atoms. So this is now the balance equation in a photosynthetic process. So let me delete this first. Another process that generates food by converting sunlight is chemosynthesis. And then next to the producers, you'll have the consumers. So they are the ones that we call heterotrophs. So a consumer is subdivided into a primary consumer, which are the herbivores or the plant-eating organisms. And then the next type of consumer is the secondary consumer, since they are the ones who eats the primary consumers. Then we also have tertiary consumers. They are the ones who eats the secondary consumers. Now, secondary and tertiary consumers are what we call herbivores. So they eat meat from other organisms. But another type of consumer is the omnivores. An omnivore can eat both meat and plants. So an example for that are the humans. The humans, we are omnivores. Just some pictures of producers or plants on Earth. So we have here the vines, the shrubs and trees in a forest ecosystem. And then we have some water lilies or floating plants and shrubs here in a pond or marshland. We have the consumers. We have the herbivores, like this giraffe. And then we have the lions as our consumers. And then here in this decayed matter, bacteria are present or fungi, so they are the decomposers. So these ones are usually the ones that breaks down organic matter into simpler inorganic compounds that will be utilized by plants later on to conduct photosynthesis again. So as stated, we also have decomposers, which are the ones that releases nutrients by breaking down decayed matter into inorganic compounds, simpler inorganic compounds. So these decomposers composes of bacteria, fungi. Then we also have the detritivores. This is another type of um, decomposers. So these are the ones that feed on dead bodies of other organism. So an example of that are vultures. We also have earthworms. Oh, so those are the detritivores. And then this is a picture of a decomposer. This one. We also have the vulture. This one is a mushroom. It's a fungus. No, it's a fungus or a fungi. So that's one example of decomposer. It's an illustration of how detritivores and decomposers degrades or decomposes a felled trunk of tree. So what are those detritus feeders? We have these longhorn beetle holes, then bark beetle engraving. Through bark beetle engraving, they chip in this wood or trunk. We also have carpenter ant galleries, then termites and carpenter ant work. So they are chipping in this trunk of wood as well. So as time goes by, so this trunk will slowly but surely disintegrates into powder that will certainly be used by plants as its nutrient nutrient source. So here is a fungus, it's a decomposer as well, and then you have fungi rather. So this is a simple illustration of how these detritivores and decomposers reduce organic or decayed matter into useful source of nutrients for plants. Now, producers, consumers, and decomposers use their chemical energy stored in glucose and other organic compounds to fuel their life processes. In most cells, this energy is released by aerobic respiration, which uses oxygen to convert glucose or other organic nutrient molecules back into carbon dioxide and water. So the net effect of the hundreds of steps in these complex processes is represented by the following chemical reaction. So we have C6H12O6, so this is glucose, plus 6 oxygen molecules. It will be converted into 6 carbon dioxide molecules plus 6 hydrogen dioxide, hydrogen um, H2O or water, dihydrogen oxide rather, or H2O plus energy. So that's how respiration works, although the detailed steps differ the net chemical change for aerobic operation um, is the opposite of that for photosynthesis. So some decomposers get energy they needed by breaking down glucose for other organic compounds in the absence of oxygen. So this is form of cellular respiration called anaerobic um, respiration or fermentation. So instead of carbon dioxide and water, so the end products of this process are compounds such as methane gas or CH4. So this is methane or ethyl alcohol. So its chemical representation is C2H6 oxygen O, and then also acetic acid. So this is acetic acid. So its chemical formula is C2H4O2. So this is a key proponent in the vinegar, so acetic acid. Another type of compound that may be developed by anaerobic respiration is hydrogen sulfide or H2S. So note that all organisms get their energy through these two processes, aerobic respiration. Meanwhile, the plants is the opposite. They are the ones who generate energy or convert energy from the sun into chemical energy via the process of photosynthesis. Summarize, ecosystems and the biosphere are sustained through a combination of one-way flow of energy from the sun through these systems and the nutrient cycling of key materials within them in keeping up with the two principles of sustainability. Now, this is an illustration or a diagram of the main structural components of an ecosystem. We have the energy, the solar energy from the sun, to be specific, and then the chemicals. So the chemicals are actually when solar energy is converted by producers, these plants, into chemical energy as a food source like glucose. So through the process of photosynthesis, solar energy is converted into chemical energy. So chemicals are one of the major components. And then we have the organisms. Organisms, we have these producers, the plants. Then the consumers, usually animals. And then we have the decomposers, bacteria, fungi, and even those detrivores. So in an ecosystem, nutrient cycling happens and the flow of energy also happens. So the nutrients or those chemical that source chemical energy. So also the flow of energy. So this one, cyclic flow of energy and nutrients. But some of these energies are being wasted into heat, this one, into the environment. So that's the diagram of the main structural components of an ecosystem. So most of the world's most important species are invisible to us. They are everywhere and they are billions and can be found inside your body, on your body, in a handful of soil, and even in a cup of ocean water. So these mostly invisible rulers of the earth are microbes or microorganisms. They are the catch-all term for many thousands of species of bacteria, protozoa, fungi, and floating phytoplanktons and zooplanktons. So most too small to be seen with the naked eye. Microbes do not get the respect that they deserve Most of us view them as primarily threats to our health in the form of infectious bacteria or germs, like fungi that cause athlete's foot and other skin diseases, and protozoa that causes disease such as malaria. But these harmful microbes rather are in the minority. We are alive because multitudes of microbes toiling away completely out of sight in our, for example, bacteria in our intestinal tracts help break down the food we eat, and microbes in our noses help prevent harmful bacteria from reaching our lungs. Now, bacteria and other microbes also help purify the water we drink by breaking down plant and animal waste that may be in the water, and bacteria and fungi such as those yeast also help to produce foods such as bread, cheese, yogurt, soy sauce, beer, and wine. Meanwhile, bacteria and fungi in the soil decompose organic waste into nutrients that can be taken up by plants that humans and most of other animals eat. So without these tiny creatures, we would go hungry and be up to our own necks in waste matter. So microbes, particularly phytoplanktons and zooplanktons in the ocean, provide much of the planet's oxygen and help to regulate the Earth's temperature by removing some of the carbon dioxide produced when we burn coal, natural gas, and gasoline. To the third section of this topic or unit, um, what happens to energy in an ecosystem? So as energy flows through ecosystems in food chains and webs, the amount of chemical energy available to organisms at each succeeding feeding level decreases. Energy flow through ecosystems in food chains and food web. So in a food chain, movement of energy and nutrients from one trophic level to the next. So from the process of photosynthesis where solar energy is converted into chemical energy and stored in and nutrients like glucose, energy then flows through feeding by the consumers, and then it also flows into the decomposition of the dead organic matter from the consumers. And then we also have food web. So it is a network of interconnected food chains. So these are composed of many food chains interconnected with each other. Now this diagram shows a food chain. So the arrows shows how the chemical energy in nutrients flows through various trophic levels in energy transfers. So solar energy is converted into chemical energy by the producers. So this chemical energy is then stored into nutrients like glucose, and it is consumed by the consumers. But some of those energy are actually released into the environment in a form of a less useful energy, which is heat. So that follows the second law of thermodynamics, that energy will always be converted into less useful from a very useful form. So these are the trophic levels. So the first trophic level, we have the producers. They are the ones that convert solar energy into chemical energy and stores this chemical energy into the nutrients. And then when these producers are consumed by the first primary consumer, a herbivore to be exact, so energy or heat is released. This is the less useful form of energy. Then some are used by this consumer to fuel his daily day-to-day activities. Also, this is a second trophic level. And then from the second trophic level, when this Herbivores are consumed by the secondary consumers, which are usually carnivores. Another heat low type of energy is released. Then a certain percentage of that heat is used by the bird, this carnivore, to fuel his day-to-day activity. And then he is consumed by yet another type of consumer, a tertiary consumer, which is usually the top carnivores. And this is at fourth trophic level, no? So some part of energy is released as heat. Then some of this energy is used by the top carnivore to fuel his day-to-day activities. And then when this top carnivore dies, his decayed remains will be decomposed by decomposers and detritus feeders. And this process also releases low type of energy, which is heat. So this is a diagram or an illustration of a food chain. Energy also flows in ecosystems through a food web. A food web is a series of interconnected food chains. So it composes of different or many food chains that are interconnected with one another. And it occurs most in ecosystems. Then the organisms that are inside the food web are assigned to trophic levels. So the first one, the producers, are assigned as the first level. Then the primary consumers are the second. Then the secondary consumers belong to the third level, trophic level. The tertiary consumers are the fourth level. And then we have detrivores and decomposers, or the processors of detritus, in all trophic levels. This illustration shows a simplified food web in the southern hemisphere. So here, so the shaded part, this one is the simplest food chain, and each component interacts with other components to form a complex food web. So whenever each component of a simple food chain interacts with other organisms outside of the shaded part, so this one creates a complex food web. Even the detrivores and decomposers here, they also have a role in making this complex food web when they interact with components that are outside the food chain itself. Now, with each link or increase in links in a food chain or food web, energy decreases. So one of those is biomass, is the dry weight of all organic matter of a given trophic level in the food chain or web. So it decreases at each higher trophic level due to heat loss. Also, in a pyramid of energy flow, so 90% of energy lost with each transfer. So less chemical energy for higher tropical levels. So from the plant itself, we have 100% energy. So when it goes to the first or the primary consumer, 90% of that is lost. So the primary consumer is left with 10% of energy. And this one, it also decreases once more to the secondary consumer. It becomes 1% energy. And then next to the secondary consumer is the tertiary. So it only takes up 0.1% energy. So that's how energy decreases as the trophic level increases. Illustration is a generalized pyramid of energy flow that shows the decrease in usable energy or chemical energy available at each succeeding trophic levels in a food chain or web. So this model assumes that with each transfer from one tropic level to another, there is a 90% loss in usable energy to the environment in the form of low quality heat. So calories and joules are used to measure energy. So 1 kilocalories is equal to 1000 calories. So from the phytoplankton, so it has 10,000 calories. So 90% of these calories is lost, and so primary consumers like zooplanktons are left with just 1000 calories, and so on and so forth with secondary consumers. So from 1000 it becomes 100 calories, and then the tertiary consumer, the humans, we only get 10 calories of energy. So the rest of those energy are lost in the form of heat. This one, and this one, and even in decomposition. Now, some ecosystems produce plant matter faster than others do. So the rate of an ecosystem's producers converting energy into biomass is what we call the gross primary productivity, and it is measured by kilocalories per meter squared per year. Now, GPP is a key measure of carbon mass flux in carbon cycle studies, which is the total carbon fixation by terrestrial ecosystems through vegetation photosynthesis. The remote sensing of vegetation GPP is an important step in analyzing terrestrial carbon cycles in response to climate change. Now, some of the biomass must be used for the producer's own respiration. So that is what we call now the net primary um, productivity. So it is the rate at which an ecosystem's producers convert solar energy um, into chemical energy minus the rate at which producers use energy for aerobic respiration. Now, ecosystems and life zones differ in their NPP. So the three most productive systems are swamps and marshes and marshes. Also have the tropical rainforests, and lastly, estuaries, or where saline water and fresh water meets. So it's usually found in the mouth of rivers. So those are example of estuaries. Then the least productive are the tundra. Then you also have desert scrub and extreme desert. So the overall productivity of system can be found in equation where the net primary production, or NPP, is equal to the gross primary production, or GPP, minus the respiration, or R. So to calculate for NPP, the formula is GPP equals GPP minus R. So the NPP is the overall efficiency of the plants in the ecosystem. This graph shows the estimated annual average NPP in major life zones and ecosystems. So we have the three most productive one. We have the swamps and marshes, tropical rainforests, and then the estuaries. And then the least we have extreme desert, desert scrub, and then what's the other one? We have tundra or Arctic and alpine. in this topic is what happens to matter in an ecosystem. So matter in the form of nutrients cycles within and among ecosystems, and the biosphere and human activities are altering these chemical cycles. So elements and compounds move through air, water, soil, rock, and living organisms in biogeochemical cycles or nutrient cycles. So the five biogeochemical cycles is the hydrologic or the water cycle, the carbon one, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and then the sulfur cycle. Now, nutrients may remain in the reservoir for a period of time, but due to human activities and organisms itself, this reservoir could be disturbed, and it leads to the release of these stored nutrients. Now, solar energy evaporates water, and then the water returns as precipitation, rain or snow, and then it goes through organisms, goes into bodies of water, and evaporates again. So water is filtered and partly purified as it moves through the hydrological cycle, and water can be stored as ice in glaciers or in underground aquifers. Now, water cycles through the biosphere, and there are three major processes in the natural renewal of water quality. We have evaporation, or the changing or conversion of the liquid state of water into its gaseous form. So when a water is directly hit by sunlight, it vaporizes water and changes its form into gas. Then we also have precipitation, or just the opposite of evaporation, whereby from its gaseous form, water turns back into its liquid form. And then the other one is transpiration. So this is the process in which plants excretes excess water through the leaves and branches of plants and trees. So alteration of the hydrologic cycle by humans can lead to withdrawal of large amounts of fresh water at a faster rate than nature, that faster rate that nature can replace it, and then also clearing of vegetation and increased flooding when wetlands are drained. Illustration of the hydrologic cycle. So let's start with the natural processes. So one of the natural processes is the evaporation of surface water. So when sunlight hits the surfaces of lakes, dams, and rivers, and then oceans, so it converts water into vapor form, and it condenses in the atmosphere here. Another type of converting water into vapor form is the transpiration by plants, in which the plant leaves and branches excretes excess water from the plant into the atmosphere in vapor form. So once this condensed clouds become thicker with moisture, it becomes a precipitate in the form of rainwater, and it falls back to reservoirs like lakes, ice and snow caps, and in oceans. So it goes back to our reservoirs and even runoffs on land, but it will eventually go enter our reservoirs here, these runoffs. Then some will precipitate back to the ocean. So these are natural processes in the hydrologic cycle. And then some of those water that are stored in our reservoirs will infiltrate into the ground and percolate into our aquifers and will form the groundwater sources. And the red, the natural ones, as what mentioned, are kind of natural reservoirs, so like our groundwater in aquifers, lakes and reservoirs, ice and snow caps, and then the ocean. Then the human impacts. So when we increase runoff on land by crops, buildings, and pavements, these are human activities. When we overpump or overutilize water for our consumption. So we consume more than what we need. And then also when we pollute our rivers and oceans and even our lakes. So pollution can also occur in the midstream. I know in the upper stream of the river, in the midstream of the river, and in downstream part. So, and also when we cut trees and forests and filling wetlands, so it increases runoffs. So this is an example of the hydrologic cycle. Ice and snow caps and even glaciers are our natural reservoirs of fresh water. So when this melts, because of our human activities, whereby we amplify the global warming of our planet by amplifying the amount of carbon dioxide and natural greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So it led to the global warming of temperatures around the globe. So it increases the melting of these glaciers. So that's how we impact our water cycle. Water also portrays in um, the erosion of rocks. So this is an important process or weathering process also in the formation of soil material. So water is also as a major role in that. Also focus on water's unique properties. We have the properties of water due to hydrogen bonds between water molecules. So we have exists as a liquid over a large range of temperature, and it changes temperature slowly. It has a high boiling point at 100 degrees Celsius, and the adhesion and cohesion property of water, and it expands as it freezes, so it becomes solid form. It also expands in its solvent form property, and it filters out harmful UV or ultraviolet rays. Now another type of cycle is the carbon cycle, in which photosynthesis and respiration depends. So the carbon cycle is the link between photosynthesis in producers and respiration in producers, consumers, and decomposers. So carbon is the building block of carbohydrates, fats, proteins, DNA, and other compounds. So when carbon circulates through the biosphere, hydrosphere, and atmosphere, producers, consumers, and decomposers circulate they are the ones who circulate this carbon. So fossil fuels also contain carbon, and we humans are altering atmospheric carbon dioxide mostly by our use of fossil fuels and our destruction of the carbon absorbing vegetation like rainforests or mangrove areas. So that's how we affect the carbon cycle. So additional CO2 added to the atmosphere is brought about by the carbon cycle, and also our human activities, through tree clearing, by burning of fossil fuels, and then it leads to the warming of our temperature because we amplify the greenhouse effect, the natural greenhouse effect of the planet. Model that illustrates the circulation of various chemicals, forms of carbon in the global carbon cycle, with major harmful impacts of human activities as shown by the red arrow. This one, the red arrows. So we'll start with the reservoirs. So the reservoirs are those in the atmosphere, from the animal itself, the consumers, and then the plants, the producers, and then the carbon in fossil fuels, and then carbon in limestone or dolomite sediments, those carbon dioxide that are dissolved in ocean and in the food web of the marine ecosystem. So those are storages of or reservoirs of carbon. So how do they cycle? The natural processes by which these carbon are cycled is, for example, diffusion. So from the atmosphere, it is diffused into the water in oceans, rivers, and lakes. And then also forest fires. Then we also have um, photosynthesis by plants, and then respiration by plants. This one, the respiration by plants and animals as well, the consumers.
And then we also have decomposition. So when organic matter that contains carbon, inorganic compounds of carbon is decomposed by decomposers, these carbon are released into the soil and even into the atmosphere, and then by compaction. Now, what are the pathways or processes by which human can naturally or harmfully impact these natural processes? So in forest fires, it could be done by humans, deforestation as well, and then in transportation or our vehicle emissions by our transport machines, and then when we burn fossil fuels, so those coal, natural gases, when we burn these fossil fuels, it increases the concentration of carbon into the atmosphere. So that's the pathway that are affected by humans. And so this is the simplified model of the carbon cycle. Now this graph shows the increase of atmospheric carbon dioxide into the atmosphere starting from 1960 to 2009. So this graph could actually be the basis for scientists to determine if we are experiencing climate change. So when you want to know if there is climate change, it takes up several years, even decades, in order to determine the pattern of increase and know if there's really a climate change. So in this picture from 1960, or in this graph rather, from 1960 to 2009, there is a gradual increase of atmospheric carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So from more than 315, or in the 1960s, it increases into um, almost 390 parts per million of carbon dioxide in 2009. So this could be formed the basis for determining if whether we are experiencing climate change. Third type of cycle, biogeochemical cycle, is the nitrogen cycle that cycles through the biosphere through the action of bacteria. So nitrogen is fixed by lightning. So nitrogen is also circulated into the biosphere through physical processes like or natural phenomena like lightning. Then we also have nitrogen fixed by bacteria and cyanobacteria. So combine gaseous nitrogen with hydrogen to make ammonia and ammonium ions. So the nitrifying bacteria and cyanobacteria combines the gaseous nitrogen with hydrogen to make these com compounds, inorganic compounds like ammonia and ammonium ions. So another one is the process of nitrification, whereby soil bacteria change ammonia and ammonium ions to nitrate ions. So nitrate ions are usually the more inorganic form of um, nitrogen that can be taken up by plants. They also have the nitrification, or the release of nitrogen into the atmosphere by bacteria. So nitrate ions back to nitrogen gas. And here's the another one is the human intervention in the nitrogen cycle. This could be additional nitrogen oxide and the nitrogen oxide in the atmosphere from burning of fossil fuels. That could also lead to acid rain, and N2O to atmosphere from bacteria acting on fertilizers and manure, and then destruction of forest grasslands and wetlands, then adds excess nitrates to bodies of water. So, and another one is the removal of nitrogen from the topsoil. Now, this is the diagram of a simplified model of the circulation of various chemical forms of nitrogen in the nitrogen cycle in terrestrial ecosystems with its major harmful human impact shown by red arrows. So, what are the reservoirs for nitrogen? We have here the atmosphere, and the animals or the consumers, and then the plants or the producers. So nitrate can also be found in soil, ammonia as well, then nitrogen in ocean sediments, and then we have nitrogen lost to deep ocean sediments. So the processes that leads to the cycling of these nitrogen compounds are the first we have electrical storms or lightning fixing of nitrogen. Then we also have volcanic activity. So when volcanoes erupts, it releases nitrogen into the atmosphere. Then nitrification by bacteria as well. So it converts nitrogen gases into nitrate in soil. And also we have uptake by plants. So the nitrates that are present in soil, when it's taken up by plants, and then the decomposition as well. So the nitrogen compounds that are present in plants when taken up by consumers, and then when this consumer dies, the organic matter contains those nitrogen compounds, and then it is decomposed once again by bacteria. So it forms ammonia into the soil. So that's one process. And then we also have human processes or human pathways that leads to the cycling of these nutrients, nitrogen. So nitrogen oxides from burning of fossil fuels and using inorganic fertilizers, and nitrates from fertilizers runoff and decomposition. So from those fertilizers that we use in our crops, it is eroded by water or run off by water into bodies of water like rivers and oceans. So then it leads into our reservoirs in the ocean. So that's one way where humans can affect the uh, cycling of nitrogen. This graph shows the human input of nitrogen into the environment is subdivided into different human um, uses. So here from 1900s to 2000, these are the projected, no, it's not the projected, is the amount of nitrogen that is being inputted into the atmosphere by human activities like burning of fossil fuels here. Um, then for nitrogen fixation in the agroecosystem, we have this, the green one, and the blue one. So from 1900s to the 2000. So this is the amount of nitrogen that is present in the atmosphere due to use of fertilizer and industrial use. And then the red one represents the total human input of nitrogen in teragrams per year into the atmosphere. And if or in our current sustainable use of nitrogen products, um, the projected amount of nitrogen by year 2050 is almost 300 teragrams of nitrogen. Is the phosphorus cycle, and it cycles through water, the earth's crust, and living organisms, and it is a limiting factor for plant growth. So without phosphorus, it could greatly or potentially impact the growth of plants, and then it also has impact of human activities by clearing forests, um, removing large amount of phosphate from earth to make fertilizers, and then erosion leaches phosphates into streams. So this is the phosphorus cycle and its major harmful human impacts. So this is a simplified model of the circulation of various chemical forms of phosphorus in the phosphorus cycle with major harmful human impacts with the red arrows, shown in the red arrows. So let's start with the natural reservoirs of phosphorus. We have phosphates in mining waste, phosphates in sewage. So those sewage waste from factories. Then we have phosphates in fertilizers. Phosphorus is also found in animals, plants, and even bacteria. Phosphate can be found also in water, like in oceans and lakes and rivers, in its dissolved form. Phosphate in shallow ocean sediments. Phosphate in deep ocean sediments. The phosphate present in the food web of a marine ecosystem. Phosphate in rock, like fossil bones and guano, and then even in the tectonic plates. Now, what are the processes that leads to the cycling of this chemical? We have erosion. This is a natural way, erosion, but it is driven by human activities like runoff from the fertilizers we use in our agricultural um, uses, and then the runoff from the sewage of our factories and plants, and then runoff from mining. So these are the pathways in which human affects the phosphorus cycle.
Have the last cycle, which is sulfur. So much of the Earth's sulfur is stored in underground rocks and minerals, and naturally they are released through volcanic eruption or anaerobic decomposition of organic matter. One of those chemicals that it could release is hydrogen sulfide or H2S. And we have sulfur dioxide and also sulfuric acid and sulfate. So human activities have also been increasing atmospheric sulfur dioxide by burning sulfur-containing fuels, refining sulfur-containing um, fuels, and converting sulfur-containing metallic um, mineral ores. Simplified model of the circulation of various chemical forms of sulfur in the sulfur cycle with major harmful impacts of human activities. So let's start with the reservoirs. So we have sulfur in ocean sediments. We have sulfur in rocks, minerals, and fossil fuels, in plants and animals, and then in the atmosphere. Now, what are the natural pathways by which these sulfur chemicals are being cycled? Natural pathway, the blue arrows. So sulfur in ocean sediments is released by bacteria as a dimethyl sulfide. It's a byproduct and then it enters the atmosphere. And then this sulfur dioxide or other chemical um, compounds of sulfur, it can be deposited into land through acid rain. So it contains sulfuric acid and sulfate. And also the stored sulfur in soil can be taken up by plants as nutrients, and then when plant dies, sulfur is returned back into soil. Then some plants are consumed by animals, and then when animal dies, the process of decaying is stored back into the soil. So the decaying process, the main reason why there is a decaying process is the decomposers. And then we also have pathways that is altered or exacerbated by humans. We have mining and extraction. So after mining and extraction, they smelt the sulfur-containing mineral ores, burning of coals, and then refining of fossil fuels that is contained in petroleum. The last section, which is how do scientists study ecosystems. Now, scientists use both field research and laboratory research, as well as mathematical and other models to learn about ecosystems. And scientists study nature directly, and one of those is field research or what we call muddy boots biology. So it involves making direct measurements and observations of ecosystems in natural settings. Then we also utilize new technologies like remote sensors. So it is a device for remote sensing that can gather data on the Earth's surface that can be converted into usable forms by the Geographic Information System. It's a computerized maps of an area that are used to examine forest cover, water resources, air pollution emissions, coastal changes, and changes in global sea temperature. All digitalized digital satellite imaging, so it is used in GIS. Then in 2005, they created a global Earth observation system. It's an Earth system that is used to. It is composed of several technologies like monitoring technologies that is used to monitor the physical, chemical, and biological spheres of the Earth. Now, this is an example of such. So it's a Google Earth image or a digital image. So it is taken by a very sophisticated camera from the outer space, from our satellites. And these sophisticated cameras can penetrate even cloud covers. No, it's very sophisticated. So it is this satellite image then is used in the GIS mapping software to really identify our resources, monitor it, and determine whether there are any changes. So this is an example. Type of research which is done in the laboratory, so laboratory research. So ecologists use tanks, um, carry greenhouses, and controlled indoor and outdoor chambers that study ecosystems in laboratory research. So this allows us to control um, light, temperature, CO2, humidity, and other variables. So we have here also culture tubes and bottles, the invention of aquaria tanks and greenhouses. So indoor and outer chambers as well. So this is supported also by field research as well. Some scientists use models to simulate ecosystems. So mathematical models and computer simulations can help scientists understand large and very complex systems. But we must remember, simulations are no better than data and assumptions used to develop models. So we need more baseline data about components and physical and chemical conditions in order to determine how well the ecosystem is functioning and anticipate how best to prevent harmful environmental changes. So we really need baseline data on the condition of the world's ecosystem to see how they are changing and to develop effective strategies for preventing or slowing their degradation. So in this topic, these are the three big ideas or the three main learning um, lessons that we need to take note of is life is sustained by the flow of energy from the sun through the biosphere, the cycling of nutrients within the biosphere, and gravity. The second big idea is some organisms produce the nutrients they need, others survive by consuming other organisms, and some recycle nutrients back to producer organisms. Then lastly, human activities are altering the flow of energy through food chains and webs and the cycling of nutrients within the ecosystems and the biosphere. So this is the end for the lecture for this topic. Here's our reference and thank you for watching and also have a good day.